Hey guys, tonight we begin with a pair of socks that refuse to dry. That may sound too small for a war of empires, artillery, and millions of men, but in a freezing trench on the Western Front, survival often shrank to something that simple. Not a grand charge, not a medal, not a line on a map, a strip of wool near a weak flame, a boot loosened for a few minutes, a corporal bending down with a lantern and telling a man to take care of his feet before the cold, wet earth took them from him. The cheap version of trench life is easy to imagine. Mud, rats, explosions, miserable men waiting for history to happen. But the winter trench was not only a place of suffering, it was a machine that attacked the body through routine. Water came first, then mud, then cold, then numbness, then the strange discipline of staying alive when every ordinary comfort had been taken away. If you enjoy drifting off to strange little corners of history, you can like, subscribe, and comment where you are listening from tonight, even if it is just one quiet word from your room. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had hardened into a long scar of trenches running through Belgium and France. It was not one single ditch, neat and straight, but a system of front lines, support lines, reserve trenches, communication trenches, dugouts, firing steps, wire, sandbags, drainage channels, and paths that could become rivers by morning. In some places, the earth was chalky. In others, it was clay. In low ground, water gathered as though it had found its natural home. The armies dug down to survive artillery, but the deeper they dug, the more the ground seemed to answer back. Winter made that answer crueler. Rain filled shell holes. Snow melted into the sides of the trench. Frost stiffened the mud, and then a thaw loosened it again, turning the bottom into a sucking floor. Duckboards, those narrow wooden paths laid across the trench bottom, could save a man from sinking ankle-deep or knee-deep into the mess, but they could also tilt, crack, or disappear beneath slime. One tired step in the dark could mean a boot pulled loose, a fall against the wall, a curse swallowed quickly because noise carried across no man's land. So survival began with movement. Not heroic movement, but careful movement. A soldier learned where to place his feet, where the boards sagged, where the corner collected water, where the trench wall had begun to slump. He learned to pass another man sideways, shoulders brushing damp wool. He learned to carry tea, ammunition, rations, messages, coils of wire, or sandbags along a path that was never only a path. It was a narrow argument between the army's plans and the weather's patience. Above him, the cold did not always arrive as a dramatic blizzard. Often it came as dampness, damp sleeves, damp puttees wrapped around the lower legs, damp blankets, damp tobacco, damp bread, damp letters from home, folded and refolded until the paper softened at the creases. A man might be wearing layers, yet still feel the cold moving inward, because nothing truly dried. Wool could keep some warmth even when wet, but it grew heavy. Leather boots hardened, softened, leaked and rubbed. Metal chilled the fingers. Rifle bolts had to be kept clean. Equipment had to be checked, because a trench did not forgive neglect. And then there were the feet. Trench foot was not simply frostbite, and it did not require the deepest freezing cold. It came from standing too long in wet, cold, filthy conditions, with circulation squeezed by boots and hours of stillness. At first there might be tingling, itching, a strange loss of feeling, or pain that seemed to move under the skin. A man could try to ignore it, because there was always another order, another watch, another repair party, another long hour before relief. But the danger of trench foot was that it turned endurance into injury. The same stillness that kept a sentry at his post could quietly damage the body that obeyed. Armies learned this the hard way. The solution was not glamorous. It was inspection. Socks. Grease. Drying. Changing. Pairing men so they checked one another's feet. Officers and medical staff pushed routines that may have felt childish to soldiers who had already seen too much. Take off the boots. Rub the feet. Put on dry socks if any could be found. Keep the skin clean. Do not stand motionless longer than orders require. These were small rules, but in winter they became a kind of battlefield knowledge. A man could survive a shell burst by chance. He survived damp by habit. The same was true of warmth. Fire was useful, but dangerous and limited. Smoke could draw attention. Fuel had to be found, carried, rationed, protected from wet. A brazier might glow in a dugout or a sheltered corner, giving off a poor, treasured heat that never seemed to reach far enough. Men huddled around it in coats that smelled of mud, sweat, tobacco and smoke, holding hands toward the warmth before being called away again. The warmth did not make the trench comfortable. It made the next hour possible. Food worked in the same quiet way. In the front line, cooking was difficult, and hot meals often had to be carried forward through communication trenches. By the time they arrived, they might be lukewarm, spilled, delayed, or cold. Tea mattered because it was liquid warmth. A ration of bread, biscuit, tinned meat, jam, or stew mattered because the body burned energy just to remain awake and shivering. Hunger in winter was not always dramatic emptiness. Sometimes it was the dull realization that a cold ration had to carry you through another watch before dawn. Night changed everything. In daylight, movement could invite a sniper's attention. After dark, the trench came alive with work. Men repaired walls, drained water, filled sandbags, carried supplies, brought up ammunition, guided relief parties, checked wire, and tried to do quietly what daylight would not allow. Winter darkness was long, but it was not restful. The army used the night because the day was watched, so sleep arrived in broken pieces, caught on duckboards, in dugouts, beneath ground sheets, against a wall, with boots still close and rifle near enough to reach. This is one of the first truths of a deadly winter in the trenches. Soldiers did not survive by conquering the cold. They survived by negotiating with it. A dry sock, a cup of tea, a checked rifle, a repaired board, a few minutes near heat, a turn of sentry duty completed without slipping into sleep. None of these things was enough by itself. Together, repeated hour after hour, they formed the thin line between a body that could continue and a body that could not. And beneath all of it, under the duckboards and the grey water and the slow breath of men trying to rest, the mud waited with perfect patience. It waited because mud did not need courage. It did not need strategy, patriotism, anger, or sleep. It only needed rain, broken ground, and thousands of boots pressing the same narrow paths into something that was no longer field and not quite road. In winter, the trench became less like a position on a map and more like an appetite. It took nails, boards, sandbags, tools, spoons, gloves, and sometimes the confidence of men who had once thought the ground beneath them was the one thing in life that could be trusted. A soldier learned this slowly. At first, he might still think of mud as dirt made wet, an inconvenience that could be scraped away. But trench mud had been mixed with too much history. Shells had churned the soil again and again, breaking drains, shattering roots, collapsing old farm boundaries, lifting buried things, and filling every hollow with water. Horses and mules pulled loads until they could pull no more. Wagons sank. Men cursed and hauled and pushed. A simple journey from reserve line to front line could become a night of dragging the body through a landscape that resisted every step. This was why boards mattered so much. A duckboard was only wood, but in that world it became a promise that the army had not entirely surrendered to the ground. The boards lifted the foot a few inches above the wet bottom of the trench. They gave a man a line to follow in darkness. They helped stretcher bearers, runners, ration parties, and relief troops keep moving when the earth wanted to fasten itself around the ankles. Yet even duckboards could turn treacherous. They grew slick with slime. They shifted under weight. They broke at the worst moment. A man stepping off one edge might find that the mud took his boot, as if it had been waiting for him personally. And because everything in the trench had consequences, losing a boot was not funny for long. A boot was warmth, protection, and permission to keep functioning. Without it, the foot met cold mud directly. The sock filled, the skin softened. A man could not simply stop the war to fix himself properly. He might have to grope downward in the dark, pull against the mud, brace a hand against the wall, and hope the boot came free before someone behind him whispered angrily for the line to move. In a warm street at home, a boot was clothing. In a winter trench, it was survival equipment. The walls could be just as uncertain as the floor. A good trench needed revetments, boards, hurdles, corrugated metal, brushwood, sandbags, and endless repair. Without support, wet earth slumped inward. A narrow passage became narrower. The firing step crumbled. Parapets sagged. The place that was supposed to protect men from bullets could begin closing around them like a badly made grave. So winter survival meant labour. Men dug, drained, lifted, packed, patched, and rebuilt. They did this under orders, under rain, sometimes under fire, often while already exhausted. The labour had a strange moral weight. A collapsed wall was not just a mess, it could expose a position. A blocked communication trench could delay food, ammunition, or medical help. A broken drain could raise the water level until men's feet stood in cold filth for hours. A damaged parapet could mean that a head lifted too high at dawn. So the work of maintenance became a form of protection. There were moments when the most important thing a soldier could do was not fire his rifle, but fill another sandbag. Sandbags were everywhere in the imagination of trench warfare, but they were not decorative. They absorbed bullets, shaped walls, held back earth, reinforced firing positions, and created the fragile geometry of survival. They were also heavy, especially wet. Filling them was repetitive, awkward work. Carrying them through a trench could bruise the shoulder and numb the hands. Stacking them well mattered, because a badly built wall failed faster. In winter, even these simple cloth sacks became part of the war against water. They sagged, froze, split, and had to be replaced. Drainage was another quiet battle. Trenches were cut through landscapes that had never agreed to hold them. Some sectors were worse than others, especially low, wet ground where water rose from below, as well as falling from above. Pumps, sumps, channels, and improvised ditches could help, but nothing permanently defeated winter rain. Men bailed water with buckets, tins, or whatever was available. They dug little runnels in the floor and tried to coax the water away. The effort could feel almost insulting. You could spend an hour persuading water to leave, and by morning it had returned as if it had never heard the order. All of this work shaped time. In a warm house, winter might be measured by sunrise, meals, lamps, and sleep. In the trench, winter time was divided by stand-to, sentry watches, ration parties, work details, shelling, inspections, and relief. Dawn and dusk carried special tension because those were moments when attack was feared. Men stood ready, tired eyes turned toward the dim shape of no man's land. Rifles were checked. Bayonets might be fixed. The cold sat inside sleeves and collars while the sky lightened by degrees. Nothing might happen. That was almost worse, because the body had spent its strength preparing for an event that did not arrive. Then the ordinary misery resumed. A man might try to shave if water and orders allowed it, not because the trench made cleanliness easy, but because armies valued discipline and because a face left too long untended could become another sign that the line between soldier and wreckage was weakening. He might clean his rifle with care that looked almost tender. Mud in the mechanism could be deadly. Damp could encourage rust. A rifle was not only a weapon, it was a test of whether the soldier still belonged to the system that held him upright. Letters from home complicated that system. They brought kitchens, streets, mothers, wives, children, brothers, shops, fields, and ordinary weather into a place where weather had become an enemy. A letter might be read in a dugout by candle stub, passed carefully with dirty fingers, folded back into a pocket close to the body. But even letters had to survive the trench. Paper dampened, ink blurred, envelopes softened. The outside world arrived fragile, and the soldier had to protect it from the same wetness that entered everything else. So the winter trench narrowed life into a series of small defences. Keep the feet dry if possible. Keep the rifle clean. Keep the wall from falling. Keep the boards underfoot. Keep the tea hot long enough to feel it. Keep the letter readable. Keep awake when it is your turn to watch. Keep quiet when quiet is needed. Keep moving when the mud wants you still. And through all of it, survival was rarely a single brave decision. It was 1,000 unglamorous acts repeated until they became instinct. The trench did not ask whether a man felt heroic. It asked whether he could notice the loose board before stepping on it, whether he could change his socks before numbness became injury, whether he could lift one more sandbag in the rain, and whether, after all that, he could lie down in damp wool and still believe that morning would come. Morning came, but not always as relief. Sometimes it arrived as a paling of the trench wall, a greyness gathering above the parapet, the outlines of sandbags becoming clearer, the wire beyond the line turning from black thread into dull iron. A man who had spent the night half awake might feel no fresh beginning at all. Dawn did not reset the body. It simply revealed what the night had done to it. There was a particular kind of tiredness that belonged to the trenches, and winter made it heavier. It was not only the tiredness of work, though there was plenty of work. It was not only the tiredness of fear, though fear had its own way of draining the muscles. It was the tiredness of never being fully released. Even when a soldier was told to rest, his body understood that the place around him had not stopped needing him. The trench might flood, a shell might fall, a sentry might call, a runner might arrive with an order, someone might shake his shoulder before his mind had reached the bottom of sleep. Sleep in the line came in fragments. A man could doze sitting up, chin dropping toward his chest, only to wake with a start because the cold had bitten through his coat, or because his boots had slipped against the duckboards. In a dugout, if the sector had dugouts and if there was room, he might lie among other men in air thick with damp clothing, tobacco, unwashed bodies, candle smoke, and the earthy smell of timber holding back the wall. The darkness there could feel protective, but never private. Someone coughed. Someone shifted. Someone muttered in a dream. Someone came down the steps with mud on his boots and a message that changed the night. Better-built dugouts, especially in some German positions, could be deeper and more solid, with bunks, timber supports, and a stronger sense of being under cover. Other shelters were shallow, cramped, or temporary, little more than scraped spaces that promised less than men needed. Conditions varied from army to army and sector to sector, but the need was the same everywhere. A body had to lie down somewhere, and the war gave it very few decent places to do so. The cold followed men even underground. Earth insulated, but it also sweated. Blankets grew damp. Greatcoats steamed slightly when men crowded into a warmer space, then cooled again into clammy weight. A soldier might remove his boots for the sake of his feet, but removing boots carried its own anxiety. What if there was an alarm? What if the trench had to be manned quickly? What if a man fell asleep too deeply and woke to chaos, struggling to lace leather with numb fingers? In civilian life, taking off boots meant the day was over. In the trench, it meant trusting the next few minutes. That trust was never complete. The army arranged time into watches and duties because the line could not sleep all at once. Sentries stood near the firing step, peering through loopholes or over the parapet when ordered, listening for movement in the dark. Listening mattered because the battlefield was often heard before it was seen. A scrape near the wire, a low voice, the dull thud of work somewhere out ahead, the sudden hush that made every man more aware of his own breathing. In winter air, sound could seem sharper, yet also confused by wind, rain, and the soft collapse of mud. A sentry had to fight not only the enemy, but the body's wish to shut down. Cold can wake a man, but long cold can also dull him. The mind begins to drift. The eyes stare too long at one patch of darkness and invent shapes. A broken stake becomes a man, and still his heart may tighten. The winter night turns ordinary objects into warnings, because warnings are what a sentry is there to find. This is one reason discipline became a survival tool. It was easy to imagine discipline only as shouting, punishment, and parade ground stiffness carried into war. But in the trench, discipline also meant shared protection. A watch had to be kept because sleeping men depended on it. Rifles had to be cleaned because mud did not care about excuses. Feet had to be inspected because one man's injury could become another man's burden on a stretcher party. Latrines had to be used, however unpleasant, because sickness spread faster when an army stopped obeying its own sanitary rules. The rules could feel small, fussy, even insulting, yet winter turned small rules into a shield. Sanitation was one of the least glamorous forms of survival. Trenches filled with men, animals, waste, spoiled food, stagnant water, and the remains of battle. Keeping any order in such a place required constant effort. Latrine trenches had to be managed, refuse had to be controlled, water sources had to be protected when possible, bodies and clothing carried lice, and lice brought itching, sleeplessness, sores, and disease. A man could be brave, experienced, and well-armed, and still be reduced to misery by insects hidden in seams. Delousing, washing, and changing clothes were easier behind the line than in the front trench, which is why rotation mattered so much. Soldiers were not usually meant to remain forever in the most exposed fire trench. They moved through cycles, frontline, support, reserve, then, if lucky, a period farther back where washing, rest, training, repairs, mail, and hot food were more possible. Heavy fighting could break any neat schedule, but the idea was essential. Survival depended on leaving the front before the front consumed the body entirely. Relief, though, was not simple. Moving a unit in and out of the line was usually done under cover of darkness. Men filed through communication trenches, carrying equipment, trying not to lose contact with the man ahead. The trench might be unfamiliar, guides might whisper directions, packs bumped against walls, rifles caught on corners, mud slowed the line. A wrong turn could cause delay. A burst of shellfire could scatter the careful order into confusion. Even going to rest required labour. When a unit reached billets or reserve areas behind the line, the word rest could mean something very different from peace. Men might clean themselves, repair equipment, drill, carry supplies, build roads, unload carts, or provide working parties. But there might also be warmer food, more space, a chance to wash socks, a barn floor instead of a trench bottom, or the simple blessing of sleeping for several hours without having to stare into no man's land. After the front, even a poor billet could feel almost unreal, and yet the trench came with them. Mud dried on clothing and fell in flakes. Lice travelled in seams. Dreams repeated the sound of shells or the pressure of standing watch. A man might be physically behind the line while still listening like a sentry. Winter survival was not only about getting through the night in the trench, it was about carrying the trench inside the body and still returning when ordered. That return is where the routine becomes hardest to understand from a distance. Modern comfort teaches us that misery should be exceptional, a thing to fix quickly or escape. For these soldiers, misery became scheduled. They learned its pattern. They knew the smell of a wet dugout before entering it. They knew how a sock felt when it was still not dry enough but had to be worn anyway. They knew the particular silence before stand to, when men rose from broken sleep and took their places, while the winter dawn slowly uncovered the wire. The morning did come, but it came like duty, not mercy. Duty was the shape that held the morning together. It told a man when to stand, when to watch, when to clean, when to carry, when to eat if food had arrived, and when to pretend that the body could be ordered into patience. But winter had its own command system. It did not shout, it simply lowered the temperature, thickened the mud, slowed the ration party, and made every small comfort arrive late, cold, or changed by the journey. Food in the trench was never only food. It was timing, transport, fuel, weather, and luck. Behind the line, army kitchens could make stews, tea, bread, and other rations with something like order. But the front trench was not a kitchen. It was a wet, narrow, watched place where smoke might be dangerous. Movement was restricted, and the safest time for bringing things forward was often night. So a meal had to travel. It might leave warm, carried in containers by men already tired, through communication trenches that twisted and dipped and filled with water. By the time it reached the front, it might be spilled, diluted, cooled, delayed, or divided among men whose hands were too cold to hold the mess tin steadily, and still it mattered deeply. A cold ration could keep a man alive. A hot ration could make him feel, for a few minutes, that the world had not entirely forgotten the needs of the body. Tea was especially powerful because it was simple, warm, and familiar. It did not solve the war. It did not dry a coat or silence a gun. But a mug of tea could move heat into the hands and throat. And with heat came a brief return of ordinary life. Men could joke around it. They could complain over it. They could hold it carefully, as if the warmth itself might spill away. The army understood that food and drink were part of morale, but understanding was not the same as control. Roads near the front were crowded, damaged, shelled, frozen, flooded, and torn by constant use. Horses, mules, carts, motor vehicles, and human carriers all became part of the supply chain. A loaf of bread or a tin of meat did not magically appear in a fire trench. It moved through depots, railheads, roads, dumps, carrying parties, and finally along the last dangerous stretch where men bent under loads in the dark. Every warm mouthful at the front carried the labour of other cold hands behind it. This is why winter survival was also a story of logistics. The soldier in the trench felt the result in his stomach, but the cause stretched far behind him. If roads were poor, if shelling interrupted movement, if weather broke the rhythm of transport, if a unit moved suddenly, the meal changed. The ration might be late, the tea might not come, the stew might be more memory than comfort by the time it arrived. He also learned the strange value of small extras, a bit of jam, a biscuit saved in a pocket, a piece of chocolate from a parcel, tobacco kept dry against the body, a tin opened carefully and shared with the man beside him. Parcels from home could carry not only calories, but evidence that someone still imagined him as a person who liked particular things. Socks, gloves, sweets, cigarettes, writing paper, or a scarf could arrive with a tenderness that the trench immediately tested. Everything had to be protected from wet. Everything had to be protected, shared, or used before the trench spoiled it. Tobacco belonged to that same world of small defences. Smoking could calm nerves, fill a pause, warm the mouth, and give the hands something ordinary to do. A cigarette in a trench was not a modern health lesson or a romantic image. It was part of the emotional equipment of men living under pressure. But even tobacco had conditions. It had to stay dry. A match had to light. A glow had to be shielded when light might give away a position. Comfort was allowed, but it had to obey danger. Warmth obeyed danger too. A brazier, a stove, or a candle could transform a dugout for a moment, but each flame had a cost. Smoke, fuel, oxygen, space and visibility all mattered. Fuel was not infinite. Wood might be damp. Coal or charcoal had to be brought forward. A fire could crowd men around it until rank and patience blurred slightly in the shared hunger for heat. Hands extended, boots steamed, socks hung where they could. Someone shifted closer than was polite, and no one blamed him much, because cold changed manners. Yet warmth could deceive. A man might dry the outside of a sock while the inside remained clammy. He might warm his feet too quickly after hours of cold and feel pain return in sharp waves. In winter, comfort often came with a shadow attached. The better the warmth felt, the harder it was to leave it. This made the movement between frontline and shelter emotionally complicated. A dugout, however cramped, offered some protection from wind and open sky. but it could also become a trap of waiting. Men listened from below to shells above, to boots on steps, to the voice calling for a working party, to rumours passed down in low tones. The warmth inside was never separate from the cold outside. It only borrowed time from it. Even eating carried that borrowed feeling. A man might crouch with his mess tin, shoulders hunched, spooning food quickly because duty could interrupt at any moment. He might taste little beyond salt, fat, and metal. He might find grit in the food and eat anyway. The body wanted fuel more than elegance. In a world where mud entered nearly everything, cleanliness became less a condition than an effort. You wiped the spoon, you covered the tin, you ate before the food cooled completely. You learned not to ask too much of appetite. The ration system also reminded soldiers that survival was collective. One man did not keep himself alive alone. Someone cooked, someone carried, someone guided the party through the dark. Someone repaired the trench so the party could pass. Someone watched the line while others ate. Someone made sure the water was used carefully. Someone complained, and that complaint, too, became part of endurance because it said the men were still measuring the world against the idea that it could be better. There was dark humour in this. Soldiers could grumble about food with great creativity. They mocked monotony, cursed cold tea, joked about hard biscuits, and treated small improvements as events worth reporting. Humour did not make the winter gentle. It made it speakable. A joke over a poor meal could turn disappointment into shared life for a few seconds. It could remind men that they were not only bodies being managed by an army. They were voices, habits, irritations, memories, and appetites gathered in a ditch. And when the meal was done, the trench took back the cup, the tin, the spoon, the hands. The brazier sank lower. The tea cooled in the bottom of the mug. The ration party prepared for another journey or tried to rest before the next one. Somewhere behind the line, more food was being counted, packed, moved, and risked forward. Somewhere in the front, a man tucked a biscuit away for later. Not because it was good, but because later was real enough to plan for. That, too, was survival in winter. The belief that there would be a later, and that when it came, even a hard biscuit in a damp pocket might matter. A hard biscuit in a damp pocket was not much of a future, but it was something a man could touch. It had weight. It could be saved, traded, eaten slowly, or forgotten until hunger made the fingers search for it again. In winter, the trench trained men to think in these little futures. Not next year, not peace, not victory in any clear shape, just the next cup of tea, the next dry pair of socks, the next parcel, the next letter, the next hour when the shelling quieted enough for someone to laugh without sounding surprised by his own voice. Morale in the trenches was not a bright feeling. It was not constant courage. It was closer to balance, the difficult art of not tipping too far into fear, anger, numbness, or despair. Armies tried to manage it with rotations, discipline, food, mail, leave when possible, chaplains, officers, medical care, rum rations in some circumstances, music, newspapers, and the simple pressure of men depending on one another. But morale also lived in smaller places that no regulation fully controlled. It lived in a joke muttered at the right moment. It lived in a dry match. It lived in the nickname of a rat, the shared insult for bad stew, the ridiculous care taken over a dented mug that had somehow become personal property. Personal property mattered because so much of trench life stripped personality away. Uniforms made men part of a mass. Orders moved them in groups. Rations fed them by number. Casualty lists counted them by unit. Yet, inside the greatcoat pocket, there might be a photograph, a pipe, a letter, a pencil stub, a religious medal, a charm, a little book, a tin, a scarf from home, or a button kept for no practical reason at all. These objects were small declarations. They said that the soldier was not only a rifle in a firing bay. He had a kitchen somewhere in memory. He had a street, a field, a language of family jokes, a hand that had written to him, a person who might still be waiting. Winter made those objects vulnerable. Paper softened. Photographs creased. Ink ran if a pocket became too wet. Tobacco spoiled. Matches failed. A scarf soaked up water until it hung heavy around the neck. Even memory seemed to need protection from damp. So a man might wrap a letter carefully, tuck it deeper inside his tunic, or reread it so often that the words became less like information and more like warmth. The letter did not have to say anything grand. News of weather at home, a child's illness, a neighbour's marriage, a mother's worry, a complaint about prices, a joke from a brother, could all arrive with strange force because they belonged to a world where winter still meant hearths, shops, muddy lanes, and ordinary inconvenience, not a trench wall sweating beside your shoulder. Writing back was another form of survival. Letters had limits: censorship, self-censorship, exhaustion, and the desire not to frighten families shaped what soldiers wrote. A man might soften conditions, turn misery into humour, say he was well enough, ask for socks, thank someone for a parcel, mention cold without explaining how cold entered the bones. He might avoid the worst details because words could carry pain home, and home already had enough fear. In this way, letters often became careful bridges. They connected the trench to civilian life, but they did not let all of the trench cross over. That gap could be lonely. The people at home imagined the war through newspapers, official language, rumours, patriotic phrases, casualty notices, and the edited courage of men who did not want to make their mothers sleepless. The soldier lived the war through mud, waiting, rats, working parties, cold food, sudden noise, and the heavy silence after it. He might want home desperately, and also feel that home could no longer understand the size of a dry sock. That is one of the quiet emotional injuries of trench winter. It changed the value of things so completely that ordinary language struggled to keep up. Humour helped fill that gap. Soldiers made jokes about discomfort, officers, rations, lice, mud, and themselves. Some humour was gentle, some was bitter, some was so dark it could only exist among men who knew exactly what was being protected by it. A joke could shrink fear to a manageable size. It could turn helplessness into performance. It could say, without saying it directly, that everyone saw the absurdity of trying to keep military neatness inside a ditch full of water. When a man joked about mud having rank, appetite, or personal hatred, he was not really confused. He was giving shape to a force that otherwise had none. Songs did something similar. A tune carried through a trench or behind the line could steady a group of men, even if the words were comic, rude, sentimental, or resigned. Singing gave breath a pattern. It made many tired bodies move through the same rhythm for a moment. It could mock authority without open rebellion, remember home without weeping, and turn fear into something shared enough to survive. In winter, when the world seemed reduced to wet wool and cold boards, the song could briefly widen the walls. Religion and belief also remained close, though not in one simple form. Some men prayed, some carried small devotional objects, some believed deeply, some doubted, and some could not make sense of providence in a landscape torn by shells. Chaplains offered comfort, burial, conversation, ritual, and a reminder that the soldier was still a soul in an institution that often had to treat him as manpower. But even belief had to pass through mud. A prayer might be whispered in a dugout while water dripped from the roof. Friendship was perhaps the most immediate shelter. Not sentimental friendship, not always even friendship in the way it might be remembered after the war, but the practical closeness of men whose lives overlapped by necessity. The man beside you noticed if you had gone too quiet. He might share a match, watch your place for a minute, help pull your boot free, remind you to change socks, curse you awake on sentry duty, or make room near the brazier. He might also irritate you beyond measure. Trench intimacy was crowded, smelly, impatient, and real. Men survived one another as much as they survived with one another. This closeness did not erase rank. Officers and enlisted men often lived under different expectations and with different privileges, though junior officers in the line also faced cold, danger, responsibility, and exhaustion. Class shaped speech, authority, comfort, and distance. But winter could reduce some differences without abolishing them. Cold touched everyone, mud climbed every boot. Fear did not check accent before entering the body. Still, an officer might have better access to shelter, servants in some contexts, or different food arrangements, while ordinary soldiers carried much of the trench's repetitive labour. Survival was shared, but not evenly shared. So morale was not one thing. It was a pocket full of fragile defences. Biscuit, letter, joke, pipe, song, prayer, photograph, friend, complaint, habit. None of them stopped the war. None of them made winter kind. But each kept a small part of the man from being absorbed completely into mud and order. And when he folded a letter away or checked that a matchbox was still dry, he was doing more than preserving an object. He was preserving the idea that somewhere beyond the trench, life still had rooms where a person could be known by name. To be known by name was no small thing in a war that had learned to count men in battalions, drafts, casualty returns, ration strength, and replacement numbers. The trench reduced life to systems, because systems were the only way armies could keep functioning at that scale. A man received orders through a chain. He drew rations through a chain. He moved through relief schedules, medical inspections, paybooks, identity discs, roll calls, and lists. Winter did not invent this machinery, but it made the machinery feel colder. When every coat looked like every other coat under a film of mud, a name became a little act of resistance. That is why roll call could carry such weight. A voice answered. And for one more morning, the system recognized that a particular man was still there. The sound might be dull, routine, even bored. Yet beneath the routine was a truth everyone understood. Some voices would not answer forever. Some names would be marked differently. Some men would go back sick, wounded, exhausted, frozen in body or spirit. Some would simply vanish into the confusion of shellfire and earth, leaving comrades to explain what could not always be fully explained. Winter made disappearance feel especially near because the ground itself was unstable. Shell holes filled with water, mud swallowed objects, trenches collapsed. A man could be separated from his unit in darkness, sent out on a wiring party, carrying party, patrol, or stretcher detail, and return changed, late, or not at all. The battlefield was not a clean stage where events could be neatly witnessed. It was broken land, poor visibility, noise, smoke, rain, darkness, and fear. Even memory had mud on it. For the living, this uncertainty shaped behaviour. Soldiers watched one another. They noticed who had a cough that worsened, who limped, who scratched constantly from lice, who no longer joked, who took too long to respond when spoken to. They did not always speak gently about it. The trench was not a room designed for delicate feelings. But practical attention could be a form of care. A man might be mocked into eating, cursed into staying awake, shoved toward the medical orderly, or told with rough impatience to change his socks before he became useless to everyone. Care often wore the face of irritation because tenderness had little space to stand. The body was always being judged. Could it carry? Could it stand? Could it climb the fire step? Could it keep watch? Could it shoot if ordered? Could it march back out after only partial rest? In winter, a soldier's body became both private burden and public equipment. His feet were his own, but they also belonged to the unit's ability to hold the line. His sleep was his own, but if he slept at the wrong moment, others might suffer. His illness was his own, but disease moved through crowded men without respecting ownership. The trench taught a harsh lesson. The individual body mattered intensely, but never only to itself. Medical care sat inside that tension. Stretcher bearers, orderlies, doctors, and aid posts formed another survival chain, one that began with noticing and often had to continue under dangerous conditions. A man with trench foot, frostbite, fever, wounds, or exhaustion might be moved from the front line to a regimental aid post, then farther back if transport, severity, and circumstances allowed. But movement was difficult. A stretcher through a muddy trench could require strength, patience, and luck. Corners were tight, boards were slick. Shelling could interrupt everything. Even rescue had to negotiate with the same winter that caused the injury. The fear of becoming a burden was real. Soldiers did not want to fail their comrades, yet the trench constantly pushed bodies toward failure. That contradiction could be cruel. A man might hide pain because he did not want to seem weak. He might keep standing in wet boots because everyone else was standing too. He might joke about his condition until it became too serious to hide. Armies depended on endurance, but winter punished men who endured without care. This is one of the quiet reversals of trench survival. Toughness alone could become dangerous. The man who ignored his feet too long might be less useful than the man who obeyed the embarrassing routine of drying them. Shame moved through these decisions. So did pride. So did fear of officers. Fear of comrades' opinions. Fear of hospitals. Fear of returning. Fear of not returning. Fear of being thought cowardly. Fear of being forgotten. The First World War placed enormous moral pressure on endurance. Men were expected to bear conditions that would have seemed impossible in ordinary life. Yet the army also knew that bodies broke. It had to inspect, rotate, treat, punish, encourage, and replace. In winter, this became a grim arithmetic between human limits and military need. Not all wounds were visible in the same way. The language of the time did not fully match what many men experienced under bombardment. Exhaustion and prolonged fear. Some shook, froze, lost speech, lost memory, could not sleep, could not stop trembling, or seemed to become strangers to themselves. Responses varied, and judgment could be harsh. The winter trench added its own pressure to the mind. Darkness, cold, confinement, anticipation, sudden noise, broken sleep, and the constant requirement to function. A man might survive outwardly and still feel something inside him withdraw to a place no officer could inspect. Yet the same trench that injured the mind could also create fierce attachments. Men remembered those who pulled them from mud, shared warmth, carried messages, gave up a dry place, or simply stayed beside them through a bad night. These were not always stories with grand speeches. Often the memory was practical. A hand under an elbow, a boot found, a blanket shifted, a place made near the stove, a name called twice because the first answer was too faint. Such acts did not cancel the horror. They made the horror survivable in pieces. The official record could not hold all of this. It could count casualties, list decorations, note weather, record operations, track supplies, and file reports. But it could not fully measure the moment when a man decided not to eat his last biscuit because the soldier beside him looked worse. It could not measure how long a photograph was held before being returned to a pocket. It could not measure the relief of hearing one's name spoken normally after a night when everything else had sounded like metal and water. So identity in the winter trench lived between the official and the intimate. The army needed the soldier as a function. His comrades knew him as a presence. Home remembered him as a son, husband, brother, friend, or boy from a particular street. He himself may have moved between all of these versions depending on the hour. On parade, he was part of a formation. On sentry, he was a pair of eyes in the dark. In a letter, he became careful and reassuring. Near the brazier, he was simply a cold man trying to get his hands warm before duty found him again. And duty always did. It came through a whispered order, a boot on the dugout step, a sergeant's voice, a runner with a message, or the slow knowledge that rest had ended. The name went back into the coat went back into the trench. The man rose, not because he had solved fear, but because the line was made of men rising before they were ready. He rose into a world that had been working before he woke. That was one of the stranger truths of the trenches. From a distance, people sometimes imagined soldiers waiting for attack, waiting for orders, waiting for relief, waiting for the war to become movement again. But in winter, waiting was full of labour. The trench had to be held together almost as if it were alive and always trying to come apart. A man might climb from a dugout with his body still pleading for sleep and find that the night's rain had changed the shape of the place. The wall near the traverse had sagged, a drain had clogged, water had risen around the duckboards, a sandbag had split, spilling earth like wet flour. The firing step needed repair before dawn made the parapet dangerous. Somewhere, a length of wire had been damaged by shellfire or weather, and a party would have to go out later, crawling or crouching into no man's land with stakes, gloves, cutters, and the knowledge that every sound might matter. This was how winter turned maintenance into courage. The popular memory of trench warfare often gathers around attacks, bombardments, and the terrible drama of going over the top. Those things were real, and they marked the war deeply. But far more hours were spent keeping the position usable. Men repaired what the weather and guns had undone. They carried timber, corrugated iron, coils of wire, pumps, ammunition boxes, water tins, and rations. They filled sandbags until the hands ached. They scraped mud from steps that would only be covered again. They rebuilt the same stretch of trench because the alternative was exposure, flooding, sickness, or failure when an alarm came. A working party had its own atmosphere. Orders passed quietly. Tools were gathered. Men checked that equipment would not rattle more than necessary. If the work was near the front or beyond it, the body tightened before the task began. The cold made fingers clumsy, but gloves could reduce feeling, and bare hands quickly numbed against metal and wet wood. A man needed touch, strength, silence, and speed, all at once. Winter made those demands argue with one another. Out near the wire, the world became wider and more frightening. The trench, for all its misery, at least had walls. No man's land removed that protection. In darkness, the ground ahead was broken by shell holes, old wire, fragments of equipment, mud, water, and things men tried not to think about too long. A wiring party might have to hammer stakes into frozen or waterlogged earth, pull wire through gloved hands, twist it into place, and then make its way back without drawing fire. The work was ordinary in purpose and extraordinary in danger. A fence had to be mended. That was all. But this fence stood between armies. Patrols carried a different tension. They might be sent to listen, inspect wire, gather information, find out whether the enemy was repairing, moving, or planning something. A patrol in winter darkness moved through a world that punished both haste and hesitation. Step too quickly, and a boot slid into water or struck metal. Pause too long, and cold crept deeper. Every man became aware of the noise made by his own clothing, his own breath, the slight pull of mud on his soul. The distance crossed might be short on a map and enormous in the body. Those who stayed in the trench listened too. Listening was labour without movement. Men learned the difference between random noises and meaningful ones, though certainty was never complete. A shovel scrape could be weather, rats, or enemy work. A muffled thud could be a loose board or something more dangerous. The winter wind could carry voices strangely. Rain could hide movement. Silence could feel like information and still mean nothing. In such conditions, nerves became instruments, always tuned, often wrong, never allowed to rest completely. The enemy was close enough to be imagined in detail and far enough to become almost unreal. Across no man's land, German, British, French, Belgian, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, African, and other soldiers in different sectors faced their own versions of cold, duty, mud, ration trouble, and fear. The script of war required each side to watch the other as a threat, and often they were, yet winter made an uncomfortable truth visible. The enemy also had wet boots. The enemy also repaired trenches. The enemy also waited for food, wrote letters, scratched at lice, and cursed the weather. Soldiers sometimes sensed this shared misery, but shared misery did not make the war gentle. It could deepen the bitterness. Men could know that the other side suffered and still fire, raid, defend, or attack when ordered. A winter trench did not turn enemies into friends. It placed human similarity inside a system built to deny it. That contradiction was one more thing a soldier had to carry without being asked whether he could bear the weight. Raids were among the ways that contradiction became action. A trench raid might be planned to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, damage works, or unsettle the enemy. In winter, such operations depended on timing, surprise, preparation, and the treacherous condition of the ground. Men blackened faces, checked weapons, rehearsed routes, watched the wire, and waited for the chosen moment. The cold did not disappear because danger increased. It came along, stiffening fingers and making every pause longer. For the ordinary soldier, the fear before such work could be mixed with relief that waiting had become doing. Anticipation is its own weather. It fills the chest, dries the mouth, sharpens small sounds, and makes time behave strangely. Yet once movement began, training and habit took over as much as thought. This is another quiet fact about survival. Sometimes men endured by becoming busy. A task gave the body instructions more precise than fear could offer, but the trench always demanded payment afterward. A working party returned soaked and shaking. A patrol came back with fewer words than when it left. A raid left men counting names in low voices. Tools had to be put away, reports had to be made, wounds had to be treated, mud had to be scraped from rifle and boot. The morning still required stand to. The trench did not pause to honour the exhaustion it had created, so the soldier learned to divide himself. One part of him watched, one part worked, one part joked, one part remembered home, and one part stayed hidden where even his closest friend might not reach. Winter made this division necessary. No one could feel everything fully and still function hour after hour. The body moved first. The feelings followed when there was room, and often there was not. The line was held in this way, not only by firepower or command, but by men accepting one more piece of work before they had recovered from the last. The trench survived because they repaired it. They survived because the trench, however cruel, still gave cover when it's held. And when the boards were straightened, the wire mended, the parapet raised, and the tools returned to their corner, the soldier might look at his hands and see that they were not steady, not warm, not clean, but still able to close around the next thing required of them. Those hands had a long memory of objects. They knew the rim of a mess tin, the rough cloth of a sandbag, the cold curve of a rifle bolt, the swollen lace of a wet boot, the small stubbornness of a button that would not fasten when fingers had gone numb. In winter, equipment was not background. It was the thin arrangement of things between a man and the weather, between a man and the army, between a man and the sudden demand to act before he felt ready. The uniform itself carried part of the burden. A soldier's greatcoat could be heavy even when dry, and in the trench it often became heavier still, taking in damp from rain, mud, breath, and the close air of dugouts. Wool helped, but wool was not magic. It warmed by trapping heat, and winter kept finding ways to steal that heat back. Sleeves darkened with moisture, collars rubbed the neck, puttees wrapped around the lower legs could support and protect, but if soaked, they held cold close to the skin. Clothing that had been issued as order became a private climate, one that a man carried wherever he went. Boots were perhaps the most important part of that climate. They had to fit well enough to march, stand, climb, and brace in mud. Too tight, and circulation suffered. Too loose, and the foot slid, blistered, and rubbed raw. A boot could be cared for, greased, dried when possible, and still be defeated by weeks of wet ground. Men learned the sound and feel of leather changing under winter's pressure. They learned that a boot left too close to heat could stiffen or crack, while a boot never dried became a cold shell around the foot. The right distance from warmth mattered. Even drying had technique. Socks became precious because they were simple, and because simplicity was rare. A clean, dry pair could feel like a luxury almost too intimate to describe. Parcels from home often included socks, and the request for more was not sentimental. It was practical love. A mother, wife, sister, aunt, church group, or local committee knitting socks far from the front might not know the exact trench where they would end up, but they were sending a form of protection. Once in the line, those socks entered the same hard economy as everything else. They had to be dried, guarded from mud, changed at the right time, and sometimes shared or lost. A helmet, when available, changed another relationship with danger. At the beginning of the war, armies learned through bitter experience how vulnerable men were to fragments and debris. Steel helmets became part of the ordinary silhouette of trench warfare, but even a helmet did not make a man feel safe. It could be cold against the head, awkward, dented, muddy, and heavy after long wear. Still, it represented a lesson paid for by casualties. The battlefield injured men not only by bullets aimed directly at them, but by pieces of the world broken loose and thrown through the air. The rifle demanded its own rituals. Mud was its enemy. So was rust. So was careless handling by a man too tired to notice grit where it should not be. A soldier might clean his rifle with a focus that looked almost peaceful from the outside. Cloth, oil, inspection, bolt, barrel, magazine, sling. The motions repeated because repetition made them possible when the mind was dull. A dirty rifle could fail at the moment when failure was unacceptable. The weapon was not only an instrument of attack or defense, it was a responsibility. Inspected by superiors and trusted by comrades. Ammunition also had to be protected. It had weight, and winter made weight feel personal. Cartridges, grenades, tools, entrenching equipment, water bottles, gas masks, bayonets, spare clothing, rations, and personal items all competed for space on the body. A soldier carried what the army required and what his own experience told him he needed. Too little, and he might be helpless. Too much, and every step through mud became punishment. The body became a moving shelf for the war's demands. Gas equipment added another layer of anxiety. Chemical weapons were not a winter problem only, but their presence changed trench life in every season. A gas mask or respirator had to be close, maintained, and trusted. It could not be buried under clutter when an alarm came. Men drilled with it, cursed it, feared needing it, and knew that failing to carry it properly might be fatal. In cold, wet conditions, straps, lenses, bags, and breathing all carried discomfort. Yet discomfort was not an argument. The equipment stayed near because the air itself could become dangerous. The shovel or entrenching tool seemed humbler, but perhaps belonged more honestly to daily trench survival. A rifle might be silent for long stretches. A shovel was always in demand. It opened drains, deepened holes, repaired walls, filled sandbags, scraped steps, and made the trench livable for one more hour. The tool connected the soldier to older forms of labour, farming, ditching, roadwork, construction. But here the earth was not being prepared for crops or houses. It was being shaped into temporary shelter under artillery fire. Light was another object with rules around it. Candles, lamps, matches, and shaded flames mattered intensely. But light could betray. A careless glow might be seen. A match struck in the wrong place could feel like an announcement. Men learned to cup hands, shield cigarettes, lower lamps, and move through darkness with partial vision. The trench at night was not completely black. It was made of glimmers, covered sparks, flares, clouded moonlight, and the sudden white exposure of very lights rising over no man's land. In those moments, everyone froze into the landscape, hoping stillness would make them less visible. The pack and pockets became a private map of necessity. A man knew where he kept his knife, tobacco, letters, spare socks if he had them, a bit of food, a pencil, a small religious object, a photograph, a piece of string, a tin opener. Something useful enough to keep and small enough not to resent. Disorder could cost time. Time could cost safety. So even in mud, there was a kind of personal organisation. The trench might be chaos, but the pocket had to make sense. All these objects changed the meaning of survival. They showed that winter did not attack only flesh. It attacked the systems that supported flesh: leather, wool, metal, paper, flame, wood, oil, straps, seams, and habits. A soldier survived by maintaining this little civilization of things around his body. He cleaned, dried, wrapped, checked, repaired, carried, and remembered. He did not always do it perfectly. No one could. But each act pushed back against the trench's desire to turn every object into something wet, heavy, useless, or lost. And when a man finally sat in a dugout, lifting one foot to loosen the boot, feeling the sock cling to his skin, setting the rifle within reach, and checking by touch that the letter was still in his inner pocket, he was not merely arranging belongings. He was rebuilding the border between himself and the winter, one small object at a time. That border was never fixed. It had to be rebuilt each day, and sometimes several times in the same day, because winter kept finding gaps: a loose seam, a wet sock, a sleeve that never dried, a scratch that became sore, a cough that settled lower in the chest, a small patch of numb skin that a man tried not to think about until the medical orderly asked him to remove his boot. The army learned to look closely at such things, because a trench was not only a fighting position, it was a place where ordinary neglect could become a casualty. A man did not have to be struck by a shell to be taken out of the line. He could be weakened by fever, lice, infected sores, exhaustion, trench foot, frostbite, bad water, or the slow collapse of resistance that came when the body had been wet and tired for too long. In winter, the medical struggle began before the wound. Foot inspections could feel undignified, almost domestic, as though the war had somehow turned grown men back into schoolboys being checked for cleanliness. Yet there was hard wisdom in it. Officers, non-commissioned officers, and medical personnel understood that feet were not private details in the trenches. They were transport. They were duty. They were the difference between holding a fire step and lying helpless in a dressing station. So men were told to remove boots when possible, dry the feet, rub them, change socks, apply grease or oil where ordered, and report trouble before pride made it worse. The difficulty was that the trench fought every part of that advice. To dry feet, a man needed time, shelter, spare socks, and some chance of warmth. To change socks, he needed socks that were not already damp. To keep boots loose enough for circulation, he still had to keep them secure enough for mud, ladders, duckboards, and sudden movement. To rest the feet, he had to stop standing. But sentry duty and work details did not vanish because his skin had begun to ache. The routing was simple, only on paper. In the trench, it required obedience, supply, and luck. Trench foot made winter intimate in a frightening way. It did not announce itself like an explosion. It crept. Tingling, swelling, numbness, pain, discoloration, a strange heaviness, a sense that the foot no longer fully belonged to the man standing on it. Some cases were mild enough to recover with care, others became severe, disabling, and dangerous. The lesson soldiers learned was not heroic, it was humiliatingly practical. Ignore wet feet long enough, and the war might remove you without the enemy ever seeing you. Lice created another kind of invasion. They lived in the seams of clothing, close to warmth, close to skin, impossible to forget once the itching began. Men scratched until skin broke. They joked about the lice because joking made disgust easier to bear, but the misery was real. Lice stole sleep, patience, dignity, and health. They also carried disease, including trench fever, which could bring fever, pain, weakness, and time away from the line. A man could fight through mud and shelling and still be defeated for days by something nearly invisible. Delousing was therefore more than cleanliness. Behind the line, when facilities allowed, men might have clothing treated, bodies washed, uniforms changed or disinfected, and blankets aired. But the relief could be temporary. Return to the same conditions, the same crowded dugouts, the same seams and blankets and shared spaces, and the enemy returned as well. The trench had many fronts, and one of them was stitched into the clothing. Rats belonged to the trench's public mythology, but for soldiers they were not mythic. They were part of the environment, drawn by food, waste, and the conditions of war. They moved through trenches and dugouts, bold from familiarity, sometimes large enough to become stories in themselves. Men hated them, joked about them, chased them, killed them when they could, and learned that even disgust could become routine if repeated often enough. A rat stealing food was irritating. A rat moving near a sleeping man's face was something worse, a reminder that the trench had lowered the boundary between human shelter and animal scavenging. Disease moved most easily where men were crowded, wet, tired, and hard to keep clean. Coughs passed in dugouts. Skin infections found openings. Stomach trouble could spread through poor sanitation or contaminated water. Cold weakened men who were already underfed or exhausted. Medical officers and sanitary personnel could issue orders, inspect latrines, check water, organise baths, and push prevention. But every order had to pass through the trench's material reality. Mud on boots entered shelters. Water found its level. Men under fire did not always have the luxury of good sanitation. Still, armies did not simply surrender to filth. That is important. The trenches were miserable, but they were also managed spaces, constantly inspected, repaired, and regulated because command understood that disease could damage fighting strength as surely as shells. Latrines were placed, moved, and policed. Refuse was supposed to be controlled. Water discipline mattered. Men were ordered to wash when they could, shave when required, care for equipment, and report sickness. These rules did not make trench life clean. They made it survivable enough to continue. The medical chain behind the line formed another kind of trench system, one made not of sandbags but of stages. A man first reported, or was noticed. He might be seen by a medical orderly, then moved to an aid post, then to a dressing station, then farther back, depending on the severity and circumstances. Each movement away from the front could feel like rescue, shame, relief, fear, or all of them at once. To leave the line sick was not the same as escape. Many men wanted treatment and dreaded being thought soft. Many also knew that recovery could mean return. This made the body morally complicated. Pain had to be judged. Was it serious? Was it ordinary? Was it weakness? Was it danger? The answer was not always clear. Soldiers became readers of their own bodies and of one another's bodies. A cough had a tone. A limp had a meaning. A man who stopped eating, stopped joking, or stared too long might be watched more carefully. The trench trained men in a rough medicine of attention, and yet attention could not save everyone. Some conditions were too severe. Some were noticed too late. Some were hidden by pride, fear, confusion, or the simple fact that everyone was miserable, so misery alone proved nothing. In such a place, suffering had to become extreme before it stood out. That may be one of the coldest truths of winter trench life. Discomfort was so normal that danger could disguise itself as another ordinary day. So survival required a difficult humility. The soldier had to accept that his body was not an enemy to be bullied into obedience forever. It was the only instrument through which duty could happen. The feet had to be dried. The lice had to be fought. The cough had to be heard. The sore had to be cleaned. The man who cared for these small weaknesses was not less brave than the man who ignored them. In winter, he might be the one who lasted. And when evening lowered itself over the line again, and the cold gathered in the cloth and leather, the medical wisdom of the trench returned to its simplest form. Take off the boot if there is time. Look closely, and do not lie to yourself about what the water has done. Looking closely was an act of honesty, and honesty was not always easy in a trench. A man could lie to an officer, to a friend, to a doctor, even to himself. But his feet had a way of answering without manners, Skin softened, toes numbed. Pain returned in sharp little messages. The boot came off, and the body reported what pride had tried to hide. Yet the trench did not pause around that discovery. Somewhere above, a sentry shifted his weight. Somewhere down the line, men were preparing to move. Relief was coming, or work was being ordered, or a ration party was gathering in the dark. The winter line ran on movement as much as stillness. If men stayed too long in one place, the trench consumed them. If they moved carelessly, the trench punished them. Survival lived between those two dangers. Rotation was one of the army's answers to that problem. A unit might spend time in the front line, then move back to support, then reserve, then farther behind the line if the system held, and no crisis interrupted it. The details varied by army, sector, year, battle, and circumstance, and any neat schedule could be broken by attack, bombardment, shortage, or command decision. But the principle mattered. Nobody could remain indefinitely in the forward trench and keep functioning. The front line had to be endured in turns. Relief, though, was not the simple comfort the word suggests. It often came at night, because darkness offered cover from observation. Men who were leaving the line had to guide or pass men coming in. The newcomers needed to learn the trench quickly, where the firing bays were, where the sentry posts stood, where water had gathered, where the duckboards were broken, where the latrine was, where ammunition was stored, which corner was dangerous, which stretch of parapet had been hit, which path must not be taken because enemy eyes knew it too well. A trench was not just occupied, it had to be inherited. This inheritance was whispered. A corporal might point with a hand rather than a voice. A soldier might touch another man's sleeve in the dark to show him where to step. The men taking over were tired from the journey forward before their frontline duty had even begun. The men leaving were tired in a deeper way, already thinking of warmth, washing, food, or simply lying down somewhere that was not watched by no man's land. But neither group could hurry too freely. Crowded communication trenches became choke points. Packs scraped walls. Rifle barrels knocked against timber. Someone slipped. Someone swore too loudly and was hushed. The whole exchange had to happen inside the nervous patience of the night. Communication trenches were the arteries of the front. They connected the forward positions to the lines behind, carrying men, messages, rations, stretchers, ammunition, water, timber, wire, rumours, fear, and relief. In winter, they were often as miserable as the fire trench itself. Some were deep and better maintained, others were shallow, broken, or choked with mud. Their bends protected against direct fire, but they also made movement slow. A party moving through them could feel as if it were travelling inside the earth's own throat. For a soldier going back, every step away from the front might feel lighter and still be difficult. The mud did not know he had earned rest. The pack did not become weightless because the line was behind him. If anything, exhaustion made the journey stranger. The body had spent days obeying sharp commands, and now it had to keep obeying when the promise of relief pulled at it like sleep. Men stumbled. Silence loosened. Some laughed too much. Some said almost nothing. Some carried private images of the trench they had just left, knowing that another group of men now stood where they had stood. Support and reserve areas were not peaceful in the civilian sense. Shells could still reach many places. Work details continued. Roads had to be repaired. Supplies had to be moved. Men trained, cleaned equipment, carried materials, and prepared to return. But distance changed the pressure. A man might wash more thoroughly. He might receive mail. He might eat food that was still genuinely hot. He might sleep in a barn, hut, cellar, tent, or billet, uncomfortable by home standards and wonderful by trench standards. He might take off his boots without the same immediate fear of an alarm. Baths and clean clothing, when available, were not luxuries in the shallow sense. They were restoration work. A bath removed mud, sweat, lice if treatment was effective, and the feeling of being sealed inside the trench's smell. Clean underwear or socks could change a man's mood, because the body understood cleanliness before the mind made speeches about it. Delousing stations, laundries, medical inspections, and baths behind the line formed part of the hidden survival system of the front. They did not appear in heroic paintings, but without them, armies would have rotted faster. The return to the line could begin almost as soon as the body started to recover. That was the cruelty of rotation. It saved men by removing them, and then spent them again by sending them back. A soldier behind the line might feel himself becoming human in small ways, only to notice the date, the order, the talk of movement, the cleaning of kit, the gathering of rations. The trench reappeared before he saw it. It reappeared in the way men checked straps and counted ammunition. It reappeared in jokes that grew harder at the edges. It reappeared in the silence before departure. Leave, when granted, could be even more disorienting. To move from the trench world toward home or a city behind the lines was to cross not only distance, but reality. Clean sheets, lights, shops, women and children in streets, plates, chairs, mirrors, a room without mud on the floor. These things could feel both comforting and unreal. A man might enjoy them fiercely and still find that part of him remained tuned to danger. He might dread the return before the leave had fully begun. He might also feel guilty for being away while friends remained in the line. Most survival, however, happened without such dramatic distance. It happened in the ordinary cycle of forward and back, cold and partial warmth, filth and partial cleaning, fear and partial rest. The word partial belongs here. Nothing was complete. Sleep was partial. Dryness was partial. Safety was partial. Recovery was partial. Even relief was partial, because every man knew that the line was still there, waiting for him or for someone like him. And yet partial things kept men alive. A half-dry sock was better than a soaked one. A few hours of sleep behind the line could steady a mind that had begun to fray. A bowl of hot stew could repair patience. A bath could return the skin to itself. A letter read under a steadier roof could make a man remember his own voice. These were not escapes from the war. They were small returns from the edge of it. So when the boot went back on, when the pack was lifted, when the column formed again and the road toward the trenches darkened ahead, the soldier carried more than equipment. He carried what recovery had managed to give him before the war asked for it back. A little warmth stored in the body, a cleaner shirt, a name answered at roll call, the memory of a dry floor, and somewhere, folded into the rhythm of his steps, the knowledge that survival was not one long act of endurance, but a repeated departure from ruin and a repeated return. The road back to the line often felt longer than the road away from it. A man who had slept under a roof, eaten something hot, or stood for a few minutes with clean skin could feel the trench returning before the first sandbag appeared. It came back through the weight of the pack, the silence of men walking in file, the familiar caution as the route neared artillery range, the way conversation thinned when the ground began to show old wounds. The body remembered before the eyes did. Then the trench received him again. The smell, the boards, the damp wall, the dark corners, the narrow places where two men had to turn sideways, the sense that every object had been waiting in the same position. Yet it was never exactly the same trench. Water had shifted, shells had altered a bay, a parapet had been repaired badly or well, a new unit had left behind different habits, different scraps, different complaints. The line seemed permanent from a distance, but up close it was always being remade by weather, labour, and damage. Across no man's land, the enemy was doing the same thing. That knowledge sat strangely in the mind. The soldier was trained, ordered, and often hardened to see the opposite trench as danger. It was danger. A head raised too high could be shot. A careless sound could draw fire. A patrol could meet another patrol in the dark and turn cold air into panic. Artillery could begin without warning, and the men on the other side might be as invisible as weather. But winter made the enemy's human outline difficult to erase completely. Smoke rose there too. Pumps worked there too. Boards had to be laid, walls repaired, feet dried, rifles cleaned, rations carried. Somewhere opposite, a man cursed his boots in German, French, English, or another language of the front. Somewhere, Another cook tried to keep food warm. Another corporal inspected socks. Another sentry stared into darkness so long that broken wire became a shape with intentions. The war depended on separation, but the weather kept drawing a rough equality over everyone exposed to it. This did not mean the front was gentle. It was not. Men could hate the enemy, fear him, mock him, and mourn friends killed by him. Raids, sniping, shelling, mines, gas alarms, and attacks made any simple story of shared suffering dishonest. Compassion could appear one moment and vanish the next under orders, grief, or retaliation. The trench was a place where recognition and violence lived uncomfortably close together. A soldier might know the man across the wire was cold and still be ready to fire if movement came. There were moments, especially remembered from the first winter of the war, when unofficial pauses, local restraint, or even brief fraternization appeared in some sectors. The most famous example, the Christmas truces of 1914, did not happen everywhere and should not be turned into a fairy tale. In many places, fighting continued. In others, men cautiously met, exchanged small items, buried the dead, talked, sang, or simply allowed silence to exist for a while. The power of those moments comes partly from their limits. They were not peace. They were small openings inside a war that soon learned to close them. By later winters, command structures were more wary of such contact. The war had hardened. The machinery of suspicion grew stronger. Yet even without open truce, there could be local habits of restraint in quieter sectors, or practical understandings around meals, repairs, or the removal of wounded and dead, depending on circumstances. These things were uneven, fragile, and never guaranteed. They belonged to the grey space between official war and human fatigue. They remind us that trench soldiers were not machines, but they also remind us that humanity alone could not stop the system around them. Winter made that system visible in small sounds: a cough across the line, a hammer striking a stake, a shovel working in frozen ground. Men knew these sounds because they made them too. Sometimes they fired at them. Sometimes they listened and did not. The decision could depend on orders, danger, habit, anger, fear, or the silent understanding that everyone needed to repair the trench before the weather finished what artillery had begun. No one could build a moral lesson out of every pause. Some pauses were merely exhaustion. The dead complicated this nearness. No man's land could hold bodies that neither side could easily reach, especially after failed attacks or heavy shelling. Winter preserved and concealed, covered and revealed. Snow might soften shapes for a while, then thaw could return them to sight. Men in the trenches had to live near those reminders, sometimes for long periods. The presence of the dead was not only horror, it was accusation, warning, memory, and practical problem. Burial, when possible, mattered because it restored a small order to land that had lost order completely. Soldiers often felt this with a seriousness beyond words. They might joke about almost anything, but there were silences that jokes did not cross. To bury a man, even an enemy, was to acknowledge that the body in the mud had once had a name, boots, hunger, letters, and a route home that had ended here. The war might require enemies. The winter trench kept producing evidence of persons. That evidence could be unbearable, so the mind learned distances. A soldier might focus on the task, not the meaning. Carry the plank, watch the wire, clean the rifle, check the feet, heat the tea, answer the roll. If every object became symbolic, no one could function, but meaning slipped through anyway. A German song carried faintly at night might remind a British soldier of singing behind his own line. A French poilu might hear work across the dark and understand the rhythm of another shovel. A man might find enemy equipment in the mud and notice how ordinary it looked. Ordinariness was perhaps the most troubling recognition. The enemy's spoon, glove, boot, matchbox, cigarette tin, or letter scrap did not look like evil. It looked like a thing a tired man would carry. This did not forgive the war or dissolve responsibility. It made the war harder to simplify. The trench was full of objects that reduced grand language to human scale, and still morning brought orders. The wire remained wire. The opposite parapet remained a threat. Men who might have shared cold in another life watched one another through loopholes and mist. Survival required this narrowing. Too much imagination could be dangerous. Too little could make a man brutal. The winter trench forced soldiers to live between those failures, holding enough humanity to remain themselves and enough hardness to remain alive. So when the cold came down again and the sentries took their posts, the enemy was both a shadow and a man. The line between those truths was as thin as the mist over no man's land, and just as easily broken by one shot. One shot could be enough to change the whole temperature of the line. Not the weather itself, but the feeling of the air. A trench that had been listening quietly could tighten in an instant. Men lowered their voices. A runner was sent. Someone asked where it came from. Someone else claimed to know. The mist still hung over no man's land. The boards were still wet. The tea still cooled in its tin. But the world had shifted from endurance into expectation. Expectation was one of the hardest climates to live inside. Artillery might begin suddenly, or it might be feared for hours before the first shell arrived. The men in the trench knew that guns far behind the enemy line could reach them without warning, and that modern war had stretched danger across distance. A soldier could be doing something ordinary, scraping mud from a step, passing a message, lifting a kettle, and the next moment the air itself seemed to tear open. Winter did not make artillery more merciful. It changed how men heard and endured it. Cold air could carry sound sharply. A distant gun might thump beyond the horizon, followed by the waiting interval that made men calculate without wanting to. Was it outgoing or incoming? Near or far? Overshooting? Searching? A shell had its own voice, and veterans learned to read it imperfectly. Some sounds meant there was time to drop. Others seemed to arrive with the explosion already inside them. Men joked about recognizing shells by tone, but the joke lived beside real attention. Listening could save a life. Listening could also exhaust it. The trench offered cover, but not certainty. Its walls protected against some dangers and intensified others. A shell striking nearby could collapse earth, smash timber, bury a dugout entrance, shatter boards, throw mud over men, break telephone lines, ruin a drain, or turn a carefully maintained bay into a heap of wet soil and splinters. A direct hit could destroy the small engineering world soldiers had built. Afterward, the living did not only count casualties, they repaired the place that had been wounded around them. This is why shellfire and maintenance belong together. The guns broke the trench. Winter made the break worse. Rain entered the new crater. Frost loosened damaged walls. Water found the opened earth. A shell did not finish when it exploded. It left work behind. Men had to dig out steps, clear communication trenches, shore up walls, find buried tools, reconnect lines, and make a new path through old ruin. The war produced destruction, and then immediately demanded housekeeping. Dugouts became precious during bombardment, though their safety depended on depth, construction, soil, and luck. Some were timbered and deep enough to give real shelter from many shells. Others were shallow holes with more promise than strength. Men crowded inside, listening to the blows above, feeling dust or earth fall from the roof, smelling damp wood, sweat, candle smoke, and fear held too close. A dugout could feel like a refuge until the thought came that it might also become a sealed place. So men listened underground in a different way. They listened for the change in rhythm. They listened for orders at the entrance. They listened for the sound that meant the shelling was lifting, which might be relief, or might be the signal before an attack. In such moments, sleep was impossible, but the body still tried to fold inward. Men sat with helmets on, rifles near, knees drawn up, boots planted. Every object ready because the moment after bombardment could demand movement. Telephone lines and runners carried the nervous system of the trench, and winter made both fragile. Wires could be cut by shellfire, buried by mud, flooded, or lost in the confusion of damaged ground. When wires failed, human messengers moved. A runner carrying orders through a shelled, dark, wet trench performed a task that looked simple only in words. He had to know the route, keep direction, avoid blocked passages, pass men going the other way, and arrive with the message still clear in his mind or pocket. Communication was survival, because confusion could kill as surely as cold. Warnings also depended on routine. Gas alarms, artillery signals, sentry calls, flares, whistles, shouted orders, and the movement of officers and non-commissioned officers all formed part of the line's response. A man learned not to treat every sound equally. Some sounds meant freeze, some meant stand ready, some meant mask, some meant carry, some meant wait, which could be the worst order, because waiting gave imagination too much room. Imagination during shellfire was dangerous, because it could run ahead of facts. A man might picture the next shell before it came, picture the roof giving way, picture the trench wall folding inward, picture the place where a friend had been standing. Yet imagination was also how men prepared. The mind rehearsed routes, duties, dangers, and small motions, where the rifle was, where the steps were, where the dugout exit stood, where the spare ammunition lay, where the stretcher might pass if the trench was not blocked. Survival required thinking enough, but not thinking too far. After a bombardment, the first quiet could feel suspicious. Ears rang. Dust settled. Men emerged blinking, not into peace, but into assessment. Who was missing? Which bay was damaged? Was the wire cut? Was the parapet exposed? Were the boards gone? Was the telephone working? Did the enemy intend to follow? The trench became a list of urgent questions, each one with mud on it. There was no clean separation between terror and labour. A man might be shaking while lifting a shovel. He might be grieving while filling a sandbag. He might be angry, numb, relieved, ashamed of relief, and still be told to help clear the passage. This was not because officers lacked feeling or because soldiers were made of stone. It was because the trench could not remain broken. A damaged trench invited more danger. Repair was not disrespect for suffering. It was the condition that allowed the survivors to remain survivors. Winter deepened the meaning of that repair. In dry weather, a damaged wall was bad enough. In cold rain, damage spread. A crater filled. A trench floor rose with water. A shelter became unusable. Men who had survived the shells could later be injured by the wet misery those shells created. The weather picked up where artillery left off, patient and thorough. And so, when night returned after shelling, the trench sounded different. The boards creaked in new places. Water moved through fresh channels. Men spoke more softly around gaps where others had been. Somewhere, a candle was relit. Somewhere, a rifle was cleaned again. Somewhere, a man bent to fix a bootlace with hands that had not yet stopped trembling. The line had been struck, but it still had to be held, and holding it meant listening once more to the cold air, waiting to hear whether the next sound belonged to the guns, the rain, or only the mud settling back into place. Mud settling back into place was not peace. It was only the ground deciding what shape the next hour would have. After shellfire, the trench often looked as if a careless giant had put his hand through it and withdrawn it covered in earth. Boards were tilted, steps vanished, walls sagged, and familiar corners became unfamiliar. Men who had known exactly where to turn in the dark now had to relearn the path by touch. The first work was always to make passage possible. A blocked trench could trap movement like a clot in a vein. Runners could not pass. Stretcher bearers could not pass. Rations could not come forward. Ammunition might sit uselessly behind a collapse, while the men ahead waited with too little. So shovels came out before feelings could arrange themselves. Timber was dragged into place. Sandbags were stacked against raw earth. Loose boards were lifted, scraped, reset, or replaced. Someone found a pump. Someone bailed water with a tin. Someone cursed because the same corner had failed again. In this work, the trench revealed its true nature. It was not a fixed shelter. It was a temporary agreement with destruction. Every wall said, for now. Every step said, if maintained. Every drain said, "Until the next shell or storm." Soldiers lived inside that agreement, and winter made them renegotiate it constantly. If they failed, the trench became less a defence than a danger of its own.
Clearing damage also meant facing what had happened to men. The narration must stay gentle here,
because the trench itself did not. A bombardment left wounds, shock, burial, confusion, and absences that could not always be sorted quickly. Stretcher bearers moved through mud with a patience that was almost impossible to imagine. They had to lift, balance, turn corners, step over broken boards, lower themselves under low cover, and keep going while the ground offered no smooth path. In winter, even mercy was heavy. The wounded had to be moved through the same narrow system that carried everything else. A man in pain might travel from the front trench to an aid post, then further back if he could be moved, and if the routes were open. The cold did not step aside for him. Rain fell on the stretcher, mud pulled at the bearer's boots, shell holes and shattered duckboards turned distance into labour. Survival depended not only on medicine, but on whether other tired men could carry one body through a trench that barely allowed two healthy men to pass. Those who remained often had little time to understand the emotional meaning of a loss. They had tasks. They had gaps in the line to fill. They had a post to cover because a friend who had stood there no longer could. In later memory, grief might have room to unfold. In the trench, grief was often folded quickly and placed somewhere inside, like a damp letter put back into a pocket because the next order had arrived. The official record could name some of this. It could write down casualties, locations, dates, shelling, repairs, weather, and changes in strength. Diaries and letters could add voices, though those voices were shaped by censorship, memory, audience, exhaustion, and the difficulty of explaining life in a trench to anyone not standing in one. The records give us enough to know the mechanisms of survival, but not enough to claim every private feeling. There are silences around the winter trench, and a careful story must leave those silences intact. Still, the surviving details are powerful because they are so ordinary. A report noting flooded trenches, a diary line about socks, a letter asking for tobacco, a medical instruction about foot care, a memory of tea after a cold watch. These fragments do not reduce the war, they restore its scale. They show that history is not only made by offensives and treaties, but by men trying to keep matches dry while empires spent their strength around them. By this point in the journey, the question of how soldiers survived begins to change. At first, it seems to ask for a list of methods: duckboards, dugouts, socks, tea, rotation, discipline, medical inspections, sandbags, humour, letters. All of these matter, but winter survival was not a toolbox laid neatly beside the trench. It was a rhythm forced onto the body. Notice, repair, warm, dry, carry, clean, watch, sleep briefly, rise again, then repeat, because the conditions returned. This repetition could make men feel trapped, yet it also gave shape to endurance. A soldier did not have to understand the whole war to know what the next minute required. He could not end the rain. He could not straighten the front. He could not bring home closer by wanting it, but he could clean the rifle, answer the sentry, pass the sandbag, share the match, check the feet, lift the stretcher, keep the tea from spilling, and step carefully where the board had shifted. That narrowness was both terrible and protective. The mind can break under too large a horizon. The trench made the horizon small. A man survived by shrinking attention to the manageable thing, not because he was simple, because the situation was too large for any human being to carry all at once. The next duty became a handrail. Winter also changed the meaning of bravery. In warmer stories, courage often looks like a single chosen moment, a charge, a rescue, a refusal to retreat. Those moments existed, but in the winter trench, Courage also looked like maintenance without applause. It looked like standing up for watch when every part of the body wanted to remain curled in the dugout. It looked like admitting that your feet were in trouble before pride made the damage worse. It looked like going out to mend wire not because the act was glorious, but because the line would be less safe if no one went. And perhaps that is why the trench is so difficult to imagine honestly. It does not give us one clean symbol. It gives us mud and systems, fear and habit, cruelty and care, orders and jokes, suffering and cups of tea. It asks us to understand survival as something both fragile and organized. Men lived because armies supplied them, because comrades watched them, because medical routines improved, because engineers and laborers fought the ground, because discipline held, because luck held, and because hour after hour, ordinary acts were repeated before they felt meaningful. The mud settled, the boards were reset, the candle was shielded, the stretcher passed slowly around the bend, and somewhere in the damaged trench, a man who had not yet slept bent down to pull a sandbag into place, pressing cold hands against wet cloth, helping the wall stand a little longer. The wall standing a little longer was sometimes the only victory available. Not victory as newspapers like to print it, with arrows on maps and confident words about advances. A trench wall that did not collapse before morning, a drain that carried water away for one more watch, a stretcher route cleared enough for bearers to pass, a ration party arriving with something still warm at the bottom of the container. These were not the victories that ended wars, but they were the ones that let men remain alive inside them. By the later years of the war, many soldiers had learned to distrust large promises. They had heard talk of breakthroughs, offensives, pressure, sacrifice, and final effort. Some believed deeply in the cause. Some held to duty more than belief. Some shifted from patriotism to comradeship, from flags to the faces near them, from the language of nations to the immediate need not to fail the man beside them. Winter pushed this narrowing even further. The cold did not ask what a soldier thought of strategy. It asked whether he could still feel his toes. This does not mean ideas disappeared. Men fought for countries, homes, regiments, families, memories, and reasons that were sometimes clear and sometimes worn thin by exhaustion. But in the trench, big ideas had to pass through small bodily facts. A man's loyalty might be sincere, yet it still needed dry socks. His courage might be real, yet it still needed sleep. His hatred of the enemy might burn, yet it still had to wait while he cleaned mud from the rifle. The winter trench reduced every abstraction to maintenance. That reduction could feel humiliating. A young man who had imagined war as movement, test, adventure, or masculine proof might find himself measuring the day by whether his underwear had dried, whether his boots leaked, whether the lice had returned, whether the tea was late, whether the latrine trench could be reached without slipping. The grand world had not vanished. It had been pushed into a ditch where its survival depended on chores. And yet chores can become sacred under pressure. Not sacred in a polished way, not with music swelling behind them, but sacred because life hangs from them. The man who checked another man's feet was doing something deeply practical and also deeply human. The soldier who shared a match in the wet dark gave away almost nothing and exactly enough. The cook who kept a kettle going behind the line, the mule driver bringing supplies forward, the engineer improving a drain, the stretcher bearer leaning into mud, the officer insisting on foot care even when men grumbled, all belonged to the same winter system. Survival was distributed across many hands. That is why no single soldier survived alone, even when his loneliness was enormous. The trench could make a man feel isolated inside his own cold body, but everything around him proved interdependence. His ration came from unseen labour. His shelter came from repaired earth. His relief came because another unit took his place. His medical care came through an evacuation chain. His morale was held partly by letters written far away, and partly by jokes spoken very close. Even his name survived in other mouths. Memory after the war often struggled with this mixture. Veterans could remember the mud with hatred, humour, disbelief, or a strange precision. They remembered weather because weather had been intimate. They remembered rats, lice, duckboards, tea, socks, boots, shell holes, the weight of wet wool, the impossibility of being clean, the sound of guns, the silence after them. Some memories became famous images, others stayed private, too small for public ceremonies and too large for ordinary conversation. The winter trench also left memories in the landscape. After the guns moved on, fields did not simply become fields again. Trenches collapsed, filled, were ploughed, preserved, visited, forgotten, rediscovered. Metal remained in the soil, names remained on memorials, letters remained in families, photographs faded, official histories arranged battles into chapters, but the weather of the trenches lived in details that refused to become strategic. A muddy boot in a museum can say something a map cannot. It says that history entered through the sole of the foot. For a sleep history, that may be the gentlest, honest way to approach this subject. Not by pretending the trenches were only sad, and not by making them louder than they need to be, but by noticing the survival mechanisms that kept men going through a winter that attacked patience, skin, sleep, and hope. The trench was deadly not only because enemies fired across it, but because it turned the environment into a slow adversary. Water, cold, mud, rot, disease, hunger, and fatigue all pressed against the soldier before he ever saw the opposing line. So how did they survive? They survived through systems, and they survived through habits, through rotation, supply, medical inspection, discipline, sanitation, engineering, dugouts, duckboards, wool, leather, oil, grease, fire, tea, tobacco, letters, songs, humour, rank, orders, fear, friendship, and luck. They survived because armies learned, slowly and unevenly, that the body had to be maintained as carefully as weapons. They survived because men learned that pride could be less useful than dry feet. They survived because someone, somewhere, kept doing the unglamorous thing. But the answer is also darker than any list. Many did not survive. Many were wounded, sickened, broken, or marked for life. The routines that saved some men were never enough to save all. The trench was not a lesson in human toughness that should make suffering seem noble. It was a place where survival was difficult precisely because the conditions were unreasonable. To endure such a winter was not proof that the winter was acceptable. It was proof that human beings can adapt to what they should never have had to endure. This is the late truth of the trench. Survival was not triumph over nature. It was compromise with a damaged world. The soldier did not defeat the mud. He learned its moods. He did not defeat the cold. He borrowed warmth in cups, coals, cloth, bodies, and brief shelters. He did not defeat fear. He worked while it stood beside him. He did not defeat exhaustion. He cut it into watches, duties, and fragments of sleep. And when another night settled over the front, the line did not look heroic. It looked dim, wet, patched, and stubborn. A few covered lights trembled under earth. Smoke moved low where it could. Men shifted their weight on boards that had been laid and relayed. Somewhere, a sock was turned near a small heat. Somewhere, a letter was folded again. Somewhere, a soldier listened to rain on the dugout roof and understood, without needing to say it, that tomorrow would not be won. It would be maintained. Maintained is a quiet word, and that is why it belongs to the trenches. It does not shine. It does not announce itself. It suggests hands doing the same work again after the first effort has been ruined. It suggests a wall that must be packed tighter, a drain that must be cleared, a rifle that must be wiped, a sock that must be turned, a man who must be woken gently or roughly because sleep has taken him too close to danger. By the last winter a soldier spent in the line, whether that winter came early in the war or near its end, he may have understood something that no training ground could teach. Survival was not a state, it was a sequence. You survived the night, then the morning, then the inspection, then the ration delay, then the working party, then the shelling, then the cold hour before dawn, then the march back, then the order to return. The word survived always had to be renewed. That renewal changed men. It did not always make them noble, and it did not always make them bitter. Human beings are rarely that tidy. Some became harder, some became quieter, some became funnier in a dark way. Some learned practical tenderness and would never have called it tenderness. Some learned to sleep anywhere. Some learned that an officer's order, a friend's joke, a dry match, or a mug of tea could hold a mind together for one more minute. Some learned that the body has its own opinion about history, and that wet feet can argue against every patriotic speech ever written. There were also things they learned not to say. The trench produced a language of understatement because ordinary words could not carry the full weight. A miserable night became a bad show. Heavy shelling became a rough time. Fear became nerves. Exhaustion became being done in. This was not because men felt little. Often it was because they felt too much and still had to speak in a way that allowed breakfast, orders, and repairs to continue. Language, like a trench wall, had to hold. When they wrote home, they often chose the smaller truth. It is cold. Socks would be useful. The parcel arrived. I am all right. Tell them not to worry. These lines can seem almost painfully plain now, but plainness was sometimes mercy. A soldier could not send the whole trench through the post. He could only send a folded version of himself, one that would not break the person reading it by the kitchen fire. And somewhere on the other side of that letter, someone knitted, packed, prayed, waited, saved newspaper clippings, watched the weather, and imagined a winter they could not truly enter. The home front did not stand in the mud, but it was connected to it by wool, paper, tobacco, food, memory, and fear. A pair of socks travelled from warm hands into cold ones. A scarf carried domestic care into a place where domestic care had no proper room to exist. A photograph made a dugout briefly larger than its walls. This is why the small objects matter at the end. They are not decorations placed around a war story to make it softer. They are the scale at which survival actually happened. A duckboard kept a man above the water. A sandbag kept earth from falling. A boot kept the foot from direct contact with mud. A spoon carried ration stew from tin to mouth. A candle made a letter readable. A match brought tobacco to life. A mug held warmth long enough for the hands to believe in it. None of these objects could stop the war. Together, they kept men from disappearing into it too quickly. The winter trench was a system of exposure and repair. Everything exposed a soldier. Weather, enemy fire, disease, exhaustion, command, memory, and the pressure of comradeship. Everything repairable had to be repaired. Wall, board, rifle, sock, skin, morale, route, silence. The terrible imbalance was that exposure never stopped, while repair depended on tired men. And still, again and again, tired men repaired. We should be careful, though, not to turn endurance into comfort from a distance. There is a temptation, when looking back, to admire survival so much that the suffering becomes strangely acceptable. But the winter trenches of World War I should not become a lesson that people can bear anything, and therefore anything may be asked of them. The more honest lesson is that people can adapt with astonishing skill to conditions that should never have been made ordinary. Their endurance deserves respect, not romantic decoration. So the final image should remain small. Not a flag. Not a charge. Not a battlefield panorama under a red sky. Just a dugout near the front, late in the night, with men breathing in damp air while the roof gives off the smell of earth and timber. A brazier glows weakly, not enough to warm the whole place, only enough to gather a few hands around it. A rifle rests nearby, cleaned because it must be. Boots stand close, dark with wet. Someone has hung a pair of socks where the heat might reach them. The socks are not dry yet. That matters. They are only less wet than before. In that small difference lives the truth of winter survival in the trenches. Not rescue, not comfort, not victory. Less wet, a little warmer, a little cleaner, a little more ready for the next watch. The improvement is almost laughably small, and yet a man's feet may depend on it. His ability to stand may depend on it. His place in the line tomorrow may depend on it. Outside, the mud waits below the duckboards. It does not hate the men, and it does not pity them. The rain moves through darkness with the patience of something older than armies. Across no man's land, another trench holds other men inside the same weather. Behind the lines, kitchens, horses, lorries, hospitals, railways, laundries, letters, and orders continue their hidden work. The war is vast, but here, for one tired soldier, it has narrowed to a drying sock, and the knowledge that before dawn someone will call his name. When that call comes, he will rise before he is ready. He will pull on wool that still holds a trace of damp. He will fasten the boot, lift the rifle, feel the cold return around the edges of the body, and step back onto the boards. The trench will ask again what it asked every winter night. Can you maintain yourself for one more hour? And somewhere between fear, habit, duty, and the faint warmth left in the sock, he will answer by moving.